Welcome to Rock Center Shorts. My name is Mike Callahan. I'm a professor of the practice here at Stanford Law School and executive director of the Rock Center for Corporate Governance. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest today. Sonia Barros is a partner in Sidley's Capital Markets Group, where she chairs the group's public company advisory subgroup focused on advising clients in corporate disclosures and governance matters. She is formerly the Chief Corporate Governance Counsel in the Division of Corporation Finance at the SEC, where she was the division's senior advisor on corporate governance policy and disclosures. Prior to that, Sonia served as the assistant director in the SEC's Office of Real Estate and Commodities, where she had oversight authority for thousands of transactions and reviews of corporate disclosures, including financial statements. Sonia brings extensive experience in advising public companies on SEC disclosures and compliance, corporate governance, and capital markets transactions. She plays a strategic role in advising clients on emerging areas of corporate disclosures, including ESG issues. And her experience includes a number of leadership roles at the SEC for over 17 years and nearly a decade in the private sector. And so we are delighted to have her expertise with us today. Thank you, Sonia, for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Happy to be here.
So this week I watched on CNBC Chairman Gensler give a talk about a bunch of different issues. And I think anybody that's following the change in the administration can tell there's a lot of activity down the road. And so given your former role as Chief Corporate Governance Counsel at the SEC, what are you seeing as top of mind for boards in terms of the SEC's agenda under Chairman Gensler?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mike. Well, first of all, in order for a public company board to effectively exercise its oversight responsibilities and fiduciary obligations, it's critical for the board to keep apprised of pending SEC rulemaking guidance and have an understanding of the potential impact this could have on a company. So Chair Gensler, he does have a very aggressive regulatory agenda, and we are likely to see a number of new additional disclosure requirements for public companies. There's, I think, something like 50 items on his regulatory agenda. We won't cover all of these today. I'll just focus on some that I think are key and very important for public companies. So first, there's ESG. So the SEC now has an all-agency approach toward ESG. It is clearly stated this is a top priority for the agency. Not a week goes by that we don't hear or see some type of comments coming out of SEC officials and commissioners on this topic. What are we likely to see? We're likely to see new disclosure requirements on ESG matters related to climate, human capital, and board diversity. For climate, Chair Gensler has given us some pretty detailed insights and outlooks into what a rule proposal may look like here. So for example, he stated that the SEC is considering requiring new disclosures in the company's Form 10-K. And this is significant because disclosures in a company's Form 10-K, they have to be accompanied by very strong controls and procedures and are also subject to a heightened liability standard. The SEC is also considering both additional qualitative and quantitative disclosures. Qualitative disclosures could include how the company's leadership manages climate-related risks and opportunities, and how these factors feed into the company's strategy. Quantitative disclosures could include Scope 1, 2, and possibly Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. For human capital, the SEC is considering more prescriptive disclosures for public companies. You may recall that in 2020, under the Republican-led SEC, the SEC added a new human capital disclosure requirement, but that was largely principles-based, enabling companies to provide the disclosures that they thought were best suited and material to their business. And Chair Gensler has talked about how that doesn't really give investors consistent and comparable disclosures. So he's looking at more prescriptive disclosures on a company's workforce, such as demographics, including diversity, workforce metrics, such as part-time versus full-time workers, workforce turnover, health and safety, skills and development training, compensation and benefits. So you can start to see how these potential new climate and human capital disclosures would be of interest to a board, right? So if a company is required to provide disclosures, say on its climate-related governance, strategy, risk management, and all these different workforce metrics in its SEC filings, the board and management will want to know this and have this in mind when it makes decisions on these items from a business perspective. Then there's board diversity, also in the ESG category. And here, I really would expect the SEC to continue to focus on enhanced disclosures rather than having any kind of diversity mandates, because the SEC is a disclosure agency and disclosures are within its authority and purview. But on this front, it's hard to say that what the SEC will adopt will go much farther than what companies have already been doing in response to private ordering, the demands of institutional investors and other stakeholders. As a result of those demands, companies have really been taking a lot of concrete steps toward having more diverse boards and providing more robust disclosures on a voluntary basis. So, these initiatives have gone much farther, I think, than where we will see the SEC go. Finally, a last point on ESG, boards should be aware that the SEC's Division of Enforcement has a 22-person ESG task force that is proactively looking for ESG-related misconduct. They're looking for material misstatements, gaps in disclosure, greenwashing, where companies are making proclamations about things they're doing related to ESG, but maybe they're not taking the steps behind the scenes to actually support those proclamations. The SEC is using sophisticated data analysis to mine and assess information and identify these violations. So companies really need to make sure that their compliance programs, controls, and procedures are in top shape on these matters. So that's ESG. A second initiative that I think boards should be aware of is the SEC's focus on cybersecurity. The SEC here, the Enforcement Division, has recently brought a number of cases on where there have been disclosure controls failures. So there may not be a gap in the disclosure that was provided, but a control failure, and also disclosure failures that relate to cyber breaches and incidents. The SEC is also thinking about new rules on this front. So we may see new requirements on disclosure with respect to how the company manages cyber risk governance, and also on how best to disclose material cyber events and breaches. And just this week, Chair Gensler gave some additional insights into what the SEC is thinking here. And he talked about how when a company is facing a cyber breach and a cyber incident, they really struggle with how much disclosure to provide, what form to provide the disclosure in, when to provide it, and where to provide it. So he discussed whether it would be helpful to companies if the SEC had a specific disclosure requirement for this, such as on a Form 8K current report. Finally, the last initiative to highlight for boards is work that the SEC is looking at in terms of proxy reform. And there are a number of items here, but I think one that is important for boards to be informed of and worth mentioning is a potential requirement for a universal proxy card. If this is adopted, this would require one proxy card in a proxy contest situation that would include the directors that are both management picked and the dissident director nominees. And recently, just this week, Chair Gensler said a draft of this proposal is in front of the SEC commissioners. So we actually may see something on this very soon.
Thank you for that. There's obviously a lot in play, and particularly thanks for highlighting the investment that the commission's made on the enforcement side. And so let's talk a little bit more about ESG. So given everything that you just mentioned and the terrific insights, what should boards be focused on now to prepare for what's coming on ESG in terms of what practical tips would you advise?
Yeah, sure. So, tips for boards to think about now. So I think the first thing that a board should consider is that they should make ESG a regular agenda item in their board meetings and discuss with management how ESG considerations factor into the company's business decisions, their strategy, their risk assessments, their management. Do they have the right personnel in place? Are they taking the right actions from a strategic and risk management perspective? Then I would say, this is a lot for a board to do. So depending upon the size of the company and, the structure of the board, they should consider whether it would be efficient to delegate oversight of some of these topics to some board committees. So what we see is fairly common for general ESG oversight. This is often delegated to the NomGov committee. For human capital management oversight, this, of course, is often delegated to the compensation committee. And then when it comes to ESG specific risk oversight, this, monitoring compliance and internal controls, this is often delegated to the audit committee. So it may not be one committee, but you may see multiple committees that the board delegates responsibility to, as these issues are complicated. Because there's so much focus on adequate reporting and perhaps additional reporting, the board should also work carefully with management to make sure that the company has comprehensive internal reporting process in place for ESG disclosures. I think it used to be that ESG disclosures maybe didn't go to the disclosure committee in the past, but this is something that the board should ensure is being reported to the right personnel. They should also consider reviewing key ESG disclosures, if not at the board level, perhaps at the committee level, and working with management, in their oversight responsibility to make sure that the company is looking carefully at their voluntary ESG disclosures on their website, disclosures in corporate sustainability reports, and making sure they're accurate and consistent with SEC filings. And this is something that the SEC is very focused on. They're looking at gaps between disclosures that are voluntary provided and those in SEC filings and any inconsistencies there. A few more items. The board should keep current with regulatory developments, significant ESG rulemakings like the ones I mentioned today, any pending legislation. They should be prepared to engage with institutional investors and other stakeholders on the topic. And last but not least is that they should also think like an activist investor and a plaintiff's attorney when thinking about their disclosure, because aside from the SEC, those are stakeholders that have been very interested in what companies are saying.
Thank you for those. Yeah, I could envision a future session on ESG activism, maybe a year from now when the new rules are in place. I want to thank you, Sonia, for taking the time to join us, given your expertise and background and the insights you just shared. Huge value to our audience of corporate board members and executives. So thank you very much. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you, Mike.